Good evening, and welcome everyone to Essential Theatrical Associates and Southern Shakespeare's Diversity Town Hall, Conversations on Black Representation in Tallahassee Theater. I am your host, Carol Hill. I represent both Southern Shakespeare as a board member and Essential Theatrical Associates as one of the founding members. In June of 2020, a letter from a group of over 90 local theater participants circulated to every predominantly white theater organization in the Tallahassee area, condemning them for the lack of institutional support during the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as their lack of diversity and inclusion within the entire fabric of each organization. This group made it very clear that they would not be participating, donating, or volunteering in any capacity until these issues were addressed with a strategic plan in place and with actions documented. As a result of this letter, my organization, ETA, decided to host a roundtable with local theaters to discuss. While no strategic plans were born out of these conversations, real concern and a few partnerships did. ETA and Southern Shakespeare have teamed up to bring you the first of a three-part town hall series. The first town hall is to discuss the foundation of theater, which is funding. Our next town hall will bring our local theaters to the table for a discussion. And our final part, we'd like to bring our artists to the forefront. So please stay tuned for the upcoming dates. During tonight's conversation, we simply seek to explore, uncover, and discuss the inequities in the distribution of funding in Tallahassee cultural arts and the lack of inclusiveness of African Americans in Tallahassee theater. Now, for the clarification of lack of inclusiveness, this is not just stage or acting, but it's directing, set design, lighting, actor training, administration, and even board membership. So thank you for joining us. I would like to introduce and welcome our esteemed panelists. Kathleen Spehar, Executive Director, Council on Culture and Arts. Dr. Antonio Cuyler, Director of the Florida State University MA program and Associate Professor of Arts Administration. And Keith Hamilton Cobb, playwright, actor, creator, and star of American Moor. Welcome and thank you not only for your participation in this important conversation, but thank you for your willingness to provide transparency, honesty, and straightforwardness. So let's jump in. Equity, diversity, and inclusion, although designed to address a professional need for change, has a very personal component to it. While each of you provide a professional expertise, you come with your very own personal experiences. We'd like to hear from each of you on the subject matter of how equity, diversity, and inclusion shaped or disrupted your personal and professional experiences. Kathleen, I will ask you to start us off.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thanks so much to ETA and Southern Shakespeare for gathering us together for this really important conversation today. So Kathleen Spehar, Executive Director of COCA, at your service here. Let me just dive in a little bit with the personal piece. So I've been in Tallahassee for about 1.5 years now. So before that, I've been, my career has really been in the arts, both at universities, teaching in K-12, in different theater companies and different arts organizations and so on. And I've been doing this for a while now. And it's really interesting because I think both the personal and the professional, as I've gotten older, have really started to come together more and more. So I'm a musician by trade, and I've done a fair amount of theater and things like that. But really, what the essence of who I always am, no matter whether it's personal or professional, is that I'm a white woman. Now I'm an older white woman. I've been privileged my whole entire life. I'm more privileged now than before, and I'm a lifelong learner in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that has come to me because of the experiences that I've had. I've always been someone that is very, very well intentioned about diversity, equity, inclusion, no matter where I've started and wherever I've worked. You know, I started out as a K-12 educator in an inner city school, and I wanted to help make change, but it was making change within the systems that I knew and through the lenses that I was in and the choices that I was making as a privileged white person without even realizing what I was doing. And so it's been really a lifelong education, and I'm still continuing to learn how to really change the industry and change myself, which it's going to help change the industry in the way that we approach this, especially as white leaders and as white leaders that have grown up with the kind of background that I've had, and that well-intentioned piece of it, I think, has really has grown, or at least expanded out into understanding more about what do I need to learn, and how then do I need to learn, use my own whiteness, my own privilege to actually impact changes in the profession itself. You know, let's face it, the profession has been typically, and especially in the United States here, you know, it's been typically white. A lot of the stages are, a lot of the art forms are, and I'm just stating what it is. And so in order to change that, we always need to start with acknowledging what we know and acknowledging what is, and then saying, where do we want this to go, and how can we help change that inclusively? How can we actually invite everybody to the table and be part of a conversation? Not a conversation where I am going to give you my expertise, but a conversation where we're all coming as equals together to have an important conversation about what we want to do, which is to produce theater, and which is to make sure that our communities have access to that, to make sure that our actors are trained, to make sure that we have opportunities in stage management and in technical theater for people of color, to make sure that the cultures of those organizations and those professions are such that they're very inclusive. It's a lot of it's work. It's work that needs to be done, that has been done to a point, and is needing to continue on, and also to continue on in some different ways so that we can get better at what we do.
Thank you, Kathleen, for sharing your experiences with us, and thank you for your honesty. Keith.
Same question, yes?
Yes, yes.
You know, when I come to talking about issues of equity and diversity and inclusion, I continue to come back again and again to the product, to theater as an American thing, as an American theater, as an American art form, and how we make it and how we can make it better. We all live and have lived in a culture with a disparate set of rules, a disparate justice, and disparate opportunities. And that extends to everything that we do. So it goes with the theater. And there are people who make valiant and just attempts at these terms. I have watched throughout my career as theater makers have attempted to approach these, what I think are fairly ill-defined dictates. Some have approached haltingly, others full on with every good intention. Still others have been dragged kicking and screaming. But while we remain as an American culture entangled in the misunderstanding of who we are and how implicit we all are to it, with that misunderstanding benefiting some and severely disadvantaging others, that remains the only thing that we should be addressing in our theater. A socially just theater is not practicing equity, diversity, and inclusion per se. It's making theater that reflects America, right? The act of making theater that does that shows it in all its beauty and ugliness. And that is the act of social justice, right? Whether a theater maker chooses to make theater that is socially just is clearly only a matter of choice at this point. As a culture, in this current age, clearly illustrated to us over the past several years, we all know what is right. It is no longer even an honest question. So the question becomes, are we just going to do it? And when I say do it, you know, as Ms. Spehar has mentioned, we need to, everybody needs to go back to school, right? We need to train theater makers, not just actors, but directors. We need to train critics because they are looking through an unequal lens at African American work and white work, right? And we need to train casting people. We need to train producers. We need to train. All of that is about just doing it at this point because we all know better, right? So when the question comes to equity, diversity, inclusion, I continue to go back to, okay, let's go back to the beginning. That will take care of itself. If we're making better American theater that reflects us, it will be equitable, diverse, and inclusive.
Thank you, Keith. Dr. Cuyler.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Because I'm cisgender, differently able, same gender loving, and a Black male, it's difficult to untangle the personal and professional when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I will say that this is a topic that I have been studying for the last 20 years. You know, I've written about it, I've thought about it, I've taught about it. But for me, a particular kind of phenomenon, I'll describe it as, it kind of stood out to me last year when we watched the iniquitous killing of George Floyd, which compelled a global racial reckoning that empowered Black cultural workers across all art forms, not just theater, to speak out about the anti-Black racism that they've experienced. And in theater specifically, though, I observed that, for example, Marie Sisko documented white theater companies that did not speak out for Black lives in her not speaking out list. And that was followed by the We See You White America Theater open letter, which over 50,000 theater workers signed. And then I saw an article about Black theater workers calling out racism on Broadway. And what's really interesting, going back to the funding piece, several arts funders have responded and started implementing some of the suggestions made by the folks who signed on to the We See You White American Theater. So the Bonfils Stanton Foundation, the Doris Duke, Ford now has the American Cultural Treasures. MacArthur, the Mellon Foundation has a Black Seed initiative where they've recently given $5 million to 50 Black-led theater companies, and they've endorsed or adopted many of these coalitions' demands. But going back and circling back to what you said, Carol, about here in Tallahassee, progress has seemed to be slower. Since the call to action for Tallahassee area theater leadership, while the theater organizations identified in that letter have responded, we have yet to see a plan, and perhaps tonight's event is the start of that work. But I just want to say we cannot squander this opportunity that the pandemic has provided us to reimagine an anti-racist theater community and cultural sector.
Thank you, Dr. Cuyler. And before we move on, you have such a compelling career. Can you tell us a little bit about your PhD and being the first African-American male to achieve that milestone?
Oh yeah, so first I'll say that being first is never fun, because, and you hope in the process that you're maybe leaving a trail for the next person, right? Or doing something to advance the next person's or people who will come after you, who may look like you or who may look differently than you, right? And so I was grateful to have good professors and to be supported at Florida State, which is where I am now teaching as an alum, which also never happens, right? Like that you graduate from a place and you get invited back to come back on the faculty. And so I would say, you know, again, like it's kind of odd and weird to say you're the first Black man to earn a PhD in a field and also the first Black male to earn promotion and tenure, because we're in the 21st century, right? Like, is that really a thing? And I want to also say that I don't think personally that there's anything special about me where I am the first and it couldn't have been someone else. It could have been many other people, but the multiverse just kind of dropped it in my lap. While I was going through the process, I had no idea I was the first.
Absolutely. And you are an extraordinary person. I don't doubt that. I bring that to the attention of our audience members to just kind of cascade, you know, again, in the 21st century, we're here and you are the first Black male PhD in your field. So moving on, you all have such a wide range of experiences and each very different, but somehow some of the same things seem to ring through for each of you. Let's shift our conversation a bit to the economic side of theater arts. Kathleen, could you speak to us about COCA and the funding process that's currently in place?
Absolutely. So COCA, the Council of Cultural and Arts here in Tallahassee, Leon County. So we're the local arts agency for Tallahassee, Leon County, and then we also service the about 100-mile radius around. The COCA was formed about 35 years ago to serve as a local arts agency. So there's an intergovernmental agreement between Tallahassee and Leon County that helps fund COCA. Not 100%, but funds a lot of COCA's operations. COCA is a nonprofit organization. And so we are associated with government, but we are actually our own nonprofit. So all that being said, we have a lot of services that we offer in marketing and grant writing and business operations. And we have different art shows that we have, exhibits and things like that. And we offer and service not just theater, but dance and music and visual arts and spoken word and films and so on and so forth. So it's pretty eclectic. One of the things we do is we've got a grant program. And that grant program's been around now for a while, but it's funded differently than it used to be. So it used to be funded by city and county, but mainly city. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, the grant program shifted over, and the funding for the program is mainly coming from the tourism development tax now. So then that's more county side. So we do get funding from city still, but primarily all the grant funding is coming from these tourism development dollars. So that's been that way for about the last 5 or 6 years. So with that money, since it's tax based, it flows up and down, but it's been building some, and it has funded 3 primary programs, and we get that funding from a penny. It used to be a penny and then a quarter penny. So those 2 things were different. So the penny is the funding source still for our cultural grant program, which is probably the closest thing that COCA has to any kind of like a general operating program where you can ask for funding for multiple programs that you do. So like a whole season of shows, you could ask for a cultural grant for. And then there's a cultural tourism marketing grant, which is specifically about a program or initiatives that are going out of market to get tourists specifically to come to Tallahassee and Leon County. So those programs still exist, they're still operating. And then the quarter penny went to a cultural facilities matching grant program that was around that specifically gave money for buildings. So when you look at what's funding the arts, culture, history, and heritage initiatives that are in this area, because that's all on the COCA portfolio, that penny and that quarter penny does it. And so fast forward now to last year, and that was the structure, but the quarter penny went away. So like I said, I've been at COCA about 1.5 years now, and so the quarter penny had already gone away. So there went all the money that was specifically for cultural facilities, and then the pandemic hits, and the amount of tourism money suddenly changes to for the very initial, was down, 50-75% from what it used to be. And so that caused that, plus all the closures and or not the closures, but the cancellations, I should say, the potential closures and things like that, really took this community and flipped the funding on its head. And so we still have, we last year moved forward with some of our own resources, COCA's own resources, to help cover some of that gap. We had some to cover, and those are gone now. And so now we're left with this funding community of compromised TDT dollars because of the pandemic, and a lot of need in our community. But so we persevere, And so we formulated, we looked at the grant program, and it really it forced COCA to really look at the values behind what's the values and the priorities of our grant programs and funding this community to do the work and the important work it needs to do. And so we really focused on access, we focused on equity, and on accessibility and flexibility, so that all of those, the grant programs this year would allow the community that kind of flexibility and freedom. We also looked at this very small amount of money that we thought we would have, that we projected we would have, and we said, okay, we've got organizations that have been doing programming for a long time, and this is not just theater, it's the other organizations we talked about. So we said we need to make sure that we step in and support them. So we did, and then we took another portion, a small portion of the money, and said we still need to open up the field for new applicants. So we did that too with our cultural grant program, and then for our cultural tourism marketing grant, we had everybody reapply. The reason why I'm going through all that is that when you look at if you look back like the last 8 years, say 8 to 10 years of who has been giving COCA grants, you'll see that they're very, very consistently with organizations who are traditionally white organizations or have traditionally just the diversity, equity, inclusion is not obvious through their programming. But and that's continued on, and that's partially because of just how COCA's grant program is functioned or is structured. But the community also, I mean, we need to understand that, you know, in order to take advantage of this program, you need to have the capacity to do that. You need to be visible enough to do that. We need to know that you exist. We need to know that, and you as an organization need to be able to have the opportunities. And I've seen, since I've been here, a lot of disconnection between them. I've even had I've had conversations with some of the leaders of color from the community, and that said, you know, I've just decided not to. I never get a COCA grant, so they just dropped out of the of applying. And so, you know, to me that says, you know, we need to look at the system which they're going into and asking about the equity of that. So this year with the pandemic, it actually gave an opportunity to open that up, and I'm happy to say that we did take at least a step forward where our cultural grant program and our recommendations for our cultural tourism marketing grant program both include more organizations of color. It's still a small percentage. I mean, we're in like the 30 to 35 percentile of the amount of grants that have been recommended, but that's an improvement. And in addition to that, though, what I've seen, and which is encouraging, is that the organizations that either have been around or have been consistently getting money from COCA are also expanding out their partnerships. And so I'm seeing more of that happening now, at least in the COCA grants that are coming through, where there are partnerships with other organizations or other artists of color, and so that is also starting to open up. But this is certainly something like this year the diversity, equity, inclusion was its own question in our grants, and it was actually at its own points and so on. So it was actually, when you look at the system of how you would assign money, that those questions and that topic actually were weighted with more points than they had been in even the year before that. So, you know, a step in the right direction, certainly far away from where it would need to be, but certainly moving the right way.
Thank you. Dr. Cuyler, you've done some research and written a paper about the inequities in the distribution of Tallahassee cultural arts public funding. Can you share some highlights with us from your paper?
Sure. In 2016, I wrote and presented a paper guided by the research question, how might Tallahassee address this problem of inequity in the distribution of cultural public funding? And to answer this question, I conducted an analysis of 4 fiscal years of funding through COCA's cultural grant program. And of course, this was before Kathleen joined COCA, so this predates her. And I learned the following. In 2014, Black cultural organizations received 9% of the total funding available. Non-Black cultural organizations received 91% of the funding, and Tallahassee Museum specifically received 36% of the funding. In 2015, Black cultural organizations received 10% of the total funding available. Non-Black cultural organizations received 90%, and Tallahassee Museum received 36%. In 2016, Black cultural organizations received 5% of the total funding available. Non-Black cultural organizations received 95%, and Tallahassee Museum received 33%. In 2017, Black cultural organizations received 9% of the total funding available. Non-Black cultural organizations received 91%, and Tallahassee Museum received 33%. During this 4-year period, funding for Black cultural organizations never reached 35%, which is representative of the Black population in Tallahassee. Furthermore, Black cultural organizations such as the Boys Choir of Tallahassee, Midtown Arts Enrichment, and the Southside Arts Complex did not receive any funding, although they applied. In 2017, I also partnered with COCA to conduct a cultural equity survey here in Tallahassee, wherein most respondents disagreed with the statement racial equity exists in Tallahassee's arts and cultural community. Most respondents also strongly disagreed with the statement arts funding is allocated equitably and fairly in Tallahassee. And in terms of major players for changing this, I believe COCA, of course, would be a part of that discourse, city and county commissioners, the Tourist Development Council, but most importantly, the community, because I think the community can compel the changes that it wants to see within the cultural sector, because we're all contributing to these funds in certain kinds of ways. This research could inform the implementation of an anti-racist cultural sector. Potential solutions could be, for example, a 30-30-30 split between small, mid-sized, and large budgeted organizations with 10% for new and emerging organizations, or we could flip the current funding pyramid so that the organizations with the smallest budgets can get more funding, so that there are more investments in those small budgeted organizations so that they can grow as well. The legacy organizations such as the ballet, the museum, symphony, and theater, and specifically Tallahassee Theater is the oldest cultural organization in this community, maybe should receive less funding to incentivize them engaging their professional staff, which seems like a luxury in this town compared to most cultural organizations, because a lot of our cultural organizations have part-time EDs or volunteers as staff. But of course, the challenge to changing all of this is Statute 1250104 on the tourist development tax. The procedure for levying authorized uses, referendum, enforcements remain the biggest challenge to this change. And because there is a bit of an asinine and neoliberal reading of this particular statute, which says that we're going to give funding to those cultural organizations who bring tourists to town, and not taking into consideration that the major organizations that have professional staff who can do all of the work to track hotel stays and that kind of thing are going to always come out on top because they have professional staff who can do it, right? And in closing, I also want to say that we know that an investment of a little more than $1 million returns $201.9 million to the local economy. And furthermore, in September of last year, a Citigroup study found that discrimination against Black people cost the US economy $16 trillion over the last 20 years. And particularly in a cultural sector that is constantly in need of revenue, I have to wonder how much has discrimination against Black people cost Tallahassee's creative economy and cultural sector?
Thank you, Dr. Cuyler. Pretty compelling research, and it paints a clear story. And you answered the question, who the major players are. Obviously, COCA, your hands are tied in certain instances because that funding flows to you. And, our city and county officials and folks, if you're out there listening, it's time that we take a serious look at that statute and what's going on in our community.
One thing if I may, Carol, just kind of interject in here, is that as far as COCA's hands being tied, I think that you know, that's the statute is the statute, and we have to of course work within that. But I do think that one of the opportunities that we have is to really look at tourism in regards to diversity in tourism. And so what are we doing to attract more African American tourists and Asian tourists and so on, and Hispanic tourists? I haven't lived in this area long enough to really know what specific ways that we're generally doing that. And I'm still learning that, but I think that that's one area that certainly that we could step into in arts and culture that maybe we haven't explored, that could passively kind of untie our hands a little bit, or maybe our hands become a lot more freer, and
Sure.
we do. And that's certainly is a way that we positively connect artists of color with other organizations who also want to work with them, and I think could help our community come up with a different way of collaboration, that even though those impressive tourism and economic numbers that Dr. Cuyler already shared, those would go up. You know, in Florida, any investment in arts and culture is a 9-to-1 return. And so that is going to continue to flow. And we're anticipating that after the pandemic, after whatever that in the heck that's going to end up looking like, but even in our way to that, that arts and culture is going to be a huge part of not only getting communities to come together again, but to make sure that that we're building differently, and we're imagining ourselves differently than we have been, especially in the way that arts and culture functions in this area.
Absolutely. Now that we've discussed the inequities in funding, culturally diverse theater, and I'd like to move into discussing the lack of inclusiveness in African Americans and Tallahassee, and theater specifically in Tallahassee. Keith, you're an expert in your profession. Can you tell us about your experiences along the way as it relates to inclusiveness, and specifically to this community? You've done some really great work in this community, and we'd like to hear your story.
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm an expert at anything, and I have only done work in that community at the pleasure of Southern Shakespeare, and they invited me down at an early point in the development of my play American Moor, and worked on it with me in collaboration with FAMU, and it was a lovely developmental experience, and I'm very grateful to them for that. Beyond that, I almost want to apologize for being. I'm listening to the academic and the businesswoman sort of lay it all out on the ground in Tallahassee proper, and I'm sort of your starry-eyed actor from New York, cheerleader, saying rah rah, you're all doing the right things. I think of things in creative terms, and really solely in creative terms, and I continually come back to we as we begin to suggest, develop, and create new practices. The minutia can be extremely complex, but at the root of it is something quite simple, and that is that we are dependent upon theater to change us. And if we don't do these things, it is to our detriment, because it doesn't, because our theater doesn't improve. It remains this thing that it's been for generations, and it really needs to change. If anything, if you ask me, it's getting worse. With regard to inclusiveness specifically, how do I speak to that? I mean, as I came up, I was included where I was included, I was excluded where I was excluded, and even when I was included, it was at the pleasure and under the instruction of a white-owned and operated structure. And so that means more often than not, even if I was, my body was being hired, it was to enact a white person to, we are now being inclusive because you are the white person in our production of 12 Angry Men. You are the black person in our production of 12 Angry Men, but there are no black people in that play, right? So you're playing this white guy. We're just switching you out, but no concern whatsoever for what I might bring to that role through my lens and through my instrument, right? And that's the work that has to continue to evolve. I think the work that we need to be doing now is realizing that inclusiveness does not simply mean more brown bodies, but the incorporation of the lives, lived experiences through those instruments and those lenses, even as they impact the Western canon. I mean, we can do exclusively African-American stories, but that doesn't necessarily make better theater either. What makes better theater is representation on stage of the entirety of the American cloth, right? And as we begin to look at and interrogate that really quite complex gestalt of us, which grows more complex and interesting all the time, there is so much to mine. There is so much new theater to make. And it really is a question of, do we want to make it? And if not, why? You know, the question, the indictment comes when we all see what to do and we don't do it, right? Why? Let's talk about that. Let's focus on that, right? And in fact, let's make some of our theater about that so the world can see it.
Absolutely. So you mentioned how you were placed in a position with your part in 12 Angry Men as the Black cast member. And so I'd love to know your thoughts about colorblind casting versus color conscious casting, and if there's a difference.
I suppose there's a difference. It would take too long to sort of parse it all out. These terms, the terms like equity, diversity, and inclusion, they can serve to confuse people and confound them in their pursuit of doing socially just creative work. Tell the truth, I tell people. Tell the truth about what the culture looks like. Put that on stage, sure, and the work will be socially just. You can't do that with only white people, either on stage or in charge, on the administrative side or on the creative side. And American theater won't improve until you do. You know, and for somebody like me, growing into maturity to the point where I can make decisions and I'm not scared to stand up for myself and for the culture of which I am representative, I become a danger in the status quo, the theater as it exists, because I will go into a room like that and say, okay, so where are we setting this play that there's this Black man in this room? Is this still 1940 something, 50 something, you know? And say, well, no, maybe it's later. How much later? Well, maybe it's 1970. I say, okay, well, if it's 1970, nobody brings a switchblade into a jury room in a courthouse, right? The whole play revolves around this switchblade that this man walks in. So how are we going to fix that? Right? If you're not ready to sit down and interrogate why this Black man is in your play, right, and what he's doing, and I'm not discouraging anybody from, it is far be it from me to discourage you. I encourage you to find the brown people in the work. You know, we affecting as this American pastiche of brown and Latino and Asian. This canon of plays that we still have and exist for reasons beyond their whiteness. There's good work here. There's good stuff to look at here, right? But we all have to do it together, right? We all have to sit down and figure out, what does the play mean to all of us and why?
So what are your thoughts about potential backlash for actors who do speak out about their experiences dealing with exclusion and diversity?
You know, Carol, but this is, we all still take our careers in our hands, making noise as performers, because this is the potential for a job, the hiring decisions are still in the hands of people for reasons that have nothing to do with creative excellence. We are not, the American theater is not in the business of making beautiful art. It's in the business of making money. And that happened somewhere. I don't know. I mean, there was always that segment, but there was also endowment, and there was also great work being done through the 60s and into the 70s and a piece of the 80s that allowed work to be done for its own sake. Art for art's sake, interrogation for interrogation's sake. You know, when you start doing yet the next incarnation of Harry Potter, or the 4 gazillionth production of Hamlet that is no different than all of the ones that came before it, you know, without interrogating anything new, not wanting, but just wanting to to pay the bills for that season, right? We're lost, and we're stuck. Did I?
Well, thank you. You definitely answered those questions, and each of you, thank you so very much for sharing your compelling stories and your expertise here. Before we take questions from the audience, I'd like to hear from each of you. What suggestions do you have for achieving equity and diversity in theater, specifically in our community theaters? And Kathleen, I'll let you start. Okay.
Sorry, I had to get the cursor over to the mute button. So, I'll try to focus on theater. I have to just admit, I don't know this community quite as well as I wish I did, especially in theater. But I can talk kind of generally about it. And, you know, I think that I've been thinking about resources as we've been talking here, that not only in regards to just the absence of the kind of resources that we need in the community to get this work done. I mean, it's, you know, I already talked about the tourism development tax, and what I failed to mention is that, you know, there's a fair amount of money that was with arts and culture that just isn't anymore, and so it's been difficult, and so trying to find other resources. But it's not only the distribution of it; it's also just the recognition then that, like Keith was talking about, where the kind of the artists and the artist thoughts and the artist-led initiatives. I mean, it's the art needs to stay at the center. And that's one of the things that would help this community, is if the art could be pushed more into the center and more into the place where it is helping drive the policies then that will dictate the resource distribution. And I mean by that, you know, COCA's got its resources, and we're really thankful for that. But when we look at the impact of what we're doing in theater, how can theater also and the arts also impact all other areas of how we live in this community? So how is it collaborating with transportation and our transportation needs, with the crime issues that are happening in this community, and so on. There's some brilliant theater initiatives in Denver where there are playwrights and police departments that were put together to talk about the stories that were happening with police brutality. And it's not a subject matter that can be, you can read it in the paper, or you could try to talk to and find the words to talk to each other about it. But if you have communities of people that are not able to talk with each other, but you can get into a room and through theater talk about it, through theater experience it and understand it better. Those are the types those are the ways that the art form can then transform the community. And I look at that as that's probably the end goal. And so there's a whole bunch of steps that you can take to get there, and including the collaborations and partnerships that I've already mentioned beforehand. And as a white leader and as a white privileged leader, going into those collaborations and going into those partnerships is also something that you want to do very intentionally, and intentionally being too that you're listening a lot, that you're coming in with a lot of openness to what your partners of color want to do, that that drives the story, or that drives the partnership, especially if you're the organization that has all the resources. It's really, really, really important to approach it that way. So it's the culture in that a partnership that we want to also have in this community, and being able to help transform that and move that. Forums like this, to have conversations together, to gather together and to talk about this openly, and in ways that hopefully we're all learning something new and grabbing onto something that could potentially we could try, that maybe we haven't done before. And for white leaders that are trying to do this, it's also about the fact that you are not going to be perfect at this, and that you are going to make mistakes. I mean, I make mistakes every day on this, but I thankfully keep going with it and try to learn from it the best I can. And I also thankfully have been with collaborators who will tell me if I'm doing something that is not keeping equity at the center, and I'm just open to continually learning from that. I also wanted just to say that this is a long game, so we want to take some short term. Some of the things we've been talking about tonight, even in Tallahassee, and that we've just been talking about in general, are some short term improvements that are to a long game. A long game, like if you caught the inauguration poem yesterday that Amanda Gorman mentioned, or that she recited. It's the long game of where we want to be. It's the long game of where we can get to stay committed to the short games to get to that long. And those are things that definitely can happen, and I believe can happen here in Tallahassee amongst the leaders and amongst the citizens of this area. I see it. I think that we can get there.
Wonderful. Dr. Cuyler.
So I want to start by saying that cultural inequity is not specific to Tallahassee. Communities across the country, such as Atlanta, Austin, Boston, Charlotte, Dallas, Denver, Houston, Los Angeles, Nashville, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and Tampa, among others, are all dealing with this wicked problem of cultural inequity. And I also see it as an issue of creative justice. When discrimination, marginalization, oppression, subjugation happens, humanity suffers grave creative deficits. And so, what I'd like to see is, there was Gabby Shutt, I believe it was, asked a question about apologizing and acknowledging. So I would love to see more folks in the cultural sector start by doing some truth acknowledging and telling around what has happened, why it's happened, and then commit to making sure that it doesn't happen again. And it's so important that everyone be given the opportunity. And Kathleen, I'm going to disagree with you on one point you said about putting the art center. I think we have to put people at the center, and use art and culture as an intervention to reveal further to people our humanity, right? And what has happened, I think, in putting art as the focus, we've forgotten about the people and the cost that people suffer as a result of putting art at the center. And so I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Cuyler. Keith.
Yeah, Carol, I realize that I went off on a tangent in your last question and never really got to the end of it, but it speaks directly to this. And, I think that you asked about the backlash, and I said, actors take their careers in their hands, and we all do, right? Protest has done that, and throughout America forever, since we've been standing up and making noise about who we are and where we are and how we'll be treated. The backlash in the theater is real, but it's good because it makes it visible. It makes it when organizations like We See You start to speak up, and there is some response that isn't all just jumping on the social equity train. We're all gonna kumbaya and we're gonna get it done. But we see voices that push back and disagree. Then it's in the air, right? Then it's not just silent and endemic and part of the social fabric that keeps this from moving in a direction. Then it can be addressed, then it can be talked to. And I think the pushback, the agitation, the protest in all of this is what we need to continue to do.
Absolutely. So we're going to take questions from our audience members. Audience members, please, if you have a question, type it into the chat box. And if you're directing it to a specific panelist, please let us know in your chat message. So I am going to start with questions that are currently in our chat box. So let's see. The first question is for you, Keith. It says, my question is for Keith. Several of my students saw you perform American Moor when you visited Tallahassee in the past. It was very powerful for them to see a Black man in a one-man show, the only performer on stage. Can you speak to your inspiration for creating that show and why you chose Othello as the bias?
I'm going to try to keep this brief. My inspiration was being Black and male in America, and where that intersected with being an actor and all the issues inherent in both. I chose Othello as this running analogy because Othello has been the play put on or urged to every African-American classically trained male actor forever. And the actor has no choice but to examine it. He may push back, he may reject it, but it's there. Nobody says, hey, you'd be a great Hamlet. You know, it's always Othello. So in the maturation process, the actor is examining that role. And what is in it? Who is this person? Why is he behaving this way? Through whose lens is this being seen? What happens if you look at it through mine? Those in broad strokes is how the play came to be. I'm really happy that she and her students were moved by the work. Thank you.
Yes, I was very moved as well. I was there at that show, and it was very compelling and very powerful to see a Black man in a one-man show that up close and personal. It was very intimate.
I continue to say that American Moor is the work of creative justice. It's one of them, and it continues to, that was six years ago or so that we were there, and has continued to develop and has continued to move audiences in that way. So it is less about me than it is about me running behind this particular tool of social justice that seems to move people across all the various American social spectrums in really interesting ways. And that's the work that I want to continue to be able to do.
Thank you, Keith. I have a question from a Michael Pritchard. More than 50 developed nations, including Canada, South Africa, France, the UK, Australia, Vietnam, Germany, and others, have a cabinet level role which serves as the country's wide Secretary of Arts and Culture. Do you all believe that the absence of this role in the US is the disconnect of several federal agencies meant to fill this gap? The NEA, the NEH, et cetera, contributes to the lack of the nationwide focus towards addressing these issues in performing arts. And that's open to who would like to take that.
Why don't I jump in, since I'm having conversations with these agencies? You know, there's nothing like a pandemic or a national crisis or a bunch of national crises all conglomerated at once to all of a sudden, all of a sudden you get to start to talk to people that haven't talked to you before. And so it's an interesting evolution of these agencies that are quickly figuring out how to work together differently. And I think that with the new administration that was just with the inauguration yesterday and a new president and the new administration and so on, there is a secretary for the arts that is proposed. And so that is something that we're hoping that will move forward. I think that the siloed approach, the NEH, the NEA, like, you know, if you're trying to find funding for your project that actually has a lot of different components. It's a play and it has a historic component and so on and so forth. You have to go right now to every single one of those agencies like it's separate. You know, it's like a neighborhood of houses, but all of them, all the doors are shut. You know, none of them are connected. None of them have a connecting hallway between them. And so right now they're looking at trying to they being the Americans for the Arts, is looking at trying to get this cabinet position in so that that person can say, great, we've got all the houses built, but now we need to build the connecting hallways and the passageways so that all these folks, all this work can flow in and out. Antonio brought up a great point about art and people. And so what I what I meant to say, and thank you for listening to me, is that the artists need to lead the way. The art, yes, needs to lead the way, but the artists need to lead the way. Because if not, it's going to be siloed. There'll be people that love to, there'll be audiences, there'll be the work, then there'll be, you know, it's all going to be disconnected. But when artists lead the way, they connect the work and connect everything together, and they connect the economics. The economics it feels so difficult when you're in that seat, but when you can get all these other components together, the economics fall into place. It just does. I mean, look at what I mean. If the arts community would have said, you know, for every Bernie meme that you're making of the after the inauguration, for every Bernie meme that's out there, it's going to be like, you know, a penny to the arts. You know, we would have like all this money now, right? Because it flows in. Success builds on success, and I think sometimes we forget that in the arts. And on the national level, it certainly has been very siloed that way. And so now with this new initiative that the Biden administration is looking at with other initiatives in the arts, we're hoping that this cabinet level position will be put into place and then can start connecting all this together. States are doing this. What's happening is it's getting connected like state by state. So if you go to different states, there you can find the rise and fall of like what of how arts and cultural funding goes, because some states have figured it out and they've got people that they're employing. But on the national level, it's just not that way. And so please keep your not only fingers crossed for us, but you know, keep rooting us on, because we do need to do this. We need to advocate as a nation for this kind of position that's going to help us connect all these resources together for us to do a better job.
I also hope that that position can also help us figure out better ways to make the case for our existence. Um, we have in the arts and cultural sector, I think um, there is this practice of double and triple dipping, right? So we want public funding, but we also want individual donations, and we also want people to pay for tickets. We want. We're always asking for, but we're not always asking what can we do. So a good example of what we could have done, I think, you know, after the call to action for theater leaders in Tallahassee, even if you thought it was just too political for you to get involved and march yourselves, what about offering water to the protesters with your logo on it, building that connection, showing community? And so sometimes I think arts and culture, we get into this position of always asking and always expecting more and more and more and more and more. At what point will we ever have enough money to do what we want to do? All of the
Absolutely.
money, all of the money that is poured into arts and culture in our country. And I sometimes get frustrated and annoyed when we make these comparative analyses to Europe, as if Europe isn't looking at us to figure out better ways to fund arts and culture, or to not even acknowledge the fact that when we get direct support from the government through nonprofit status, that has a monetary value that we haven't actually calculated. So we actually might be on par with Europe, but we don't know it yet because no one's bothered to look at it from a cultural economic perspective and find out, well, what is the value of having nonprofit status financially for arts and cultural organizations?
Thank you, Kathleen and Dr. Cuyler. We have another question. It's from Patrice Floyd. We have heard that the Black population in Tallahassee doesn't put enough money into the local tourism industry. Therefore, they don't need any more money. Perhaps the people who normally stay in Tallahassee hotels during the FAMU football season should stay in Jacksonville in 2021 and drive on to the game. This is the likeness of not riding the bus in the 60s. It was a lack of dollars flowing into the city that gathered the necessary attention. As Black people in performing arts, we are tired of waiting. Tallahassee feels like the Deep South. It isn't true that the Black dollar is not substantial in Tallahassee. And so there's not necessarily a question posed here, but some very valid points, Patrice. And when we talk about local tourism and we talk about the football seasons, as a former hotelier, I worked for a very prominent hotel industry for 12 years. And we paid bed tax to the county in order for that money to go back into tourism. That's how it flowed through. There is no button in our system that can determine if the guest was Black, white, plaid, Asian. We can't, there's no way for us to determine. The Black dollar is substantial. In other industries, there might be a way to determine, and the only way that they can really speculate is through the types of events that happen. So if it's FAMU's homecoming, then they can pretty much, determine if those dollars are all from the Black community. But there are Black tourists that come in for, FSU games as well. So, that's bogus. It's bogus. And we need people like you and the folks in this particular group right now, this town hall, to make those call outs and to change this rhetoric because yes, the Black dollar is substantial in Tallahassee.
Carol, can I just make one little comment? Just because you brought up just such a great point about bias, and that's one of the things I don't know if we've necessarily called it what it is, but we just have to be very careful about that too, because audiences are audiences, like you just pointed out, right? And so I have seen us, at least in the conversations in this community, at least leaning towards, if not into, the biases of that audiences are segmented too. So we have our organizations of color will attract the will attract audiences of color, and it's like it just doesn't work that way. It just people are people. Everyone in this room, we could sit here if we decided to change the topic and talk about something else. We'd be all over the place with our likes and I think we just really want to make sure that if conversations, whether it's tourism or economics or whatever, if it starts to go into those more biased assumptions, we just need to call it out and make sure that we're not doing that, because then that gets us into it influences decisions then. And so we want to make sure that we're being as open and as honest. And if we don't know something, like if we really don't know what the racial makeup of some of these audiences are, and we want to find out, is there actually an accurate way of doing that? And that and help each other out that way.
Absolutely. Our next question comes from E. Marie Sissel. Hi all, there's a misconception that Black theater isn't as good. I have heard someone say that they were surprised at how good a certain Black production was. how do you erase the misconception that theater is less than when produced, staged, and directed by Black people? How do you combat that lie?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult because of the metrics, because of what's being applied and through what lens the metrics are being applied. There has been a history of having to be better than, right? To be more than, to be perceived as equal or almost equal. And as I've said, that applies to this along with everything else in American culture. How do you do it?
Or do you do it?
Or do you do it? Is that what you said, Dr. Cuyler?
Yeah, I
Speak
mean,
to that, please.
you know, it's just so frustrating, right? Because so we've been making and trying to combat it for years. And trying to combat it has not worked, right? So what if we went on the offense and actually just did our work? We know the quality of our work. We know how compelling it is. We know how it impacts people's lives. And so I almost feel like with those kinds of conversations, I'm just not, I'm exhausted of them. And so I just I don't have it in me to even try to combat that even anymore. Because if I were to tell you the number of mediocre plays that only centered white people that I've sat through, yeah.
You know, and I'd be compelled to say something very provocative, Miss Sissel. So, you know, obviously it's not just in the theater world that we struggle with, you know, our work being less than. And so we go back to segregation when the implementation of separate but equal was put into place. And really that's that's honestly contradictive. So you put these processes in place that was supposed to give us equal opportunities, equal facilities, equal training in all of these areas, then certainly at this point in 2021, our work at some point should be just as good as. So we see how systemic racism and segregation and all of those institutions of just disparity has come home to roost. So, you know, I would be compelled to say that, yeah, you know, just produce the work, and you're always going to have critics. And and I'm a product of FAMU Essential Theater, so I know my work is good.
That's essential to know what you do is good, to know that you have value. But I would ask both of you, we can pursue excellence forever within our circles, and it can be truly excellent. And we all know that. But if we are not being given the platforms for visibility or the money to reach them or maintain them, that's about advertising dollars, marketing dollars. What I mean, I think I hear you both saying, well, just do the work, and I get that. You know, at the root of it, if you don't have the work, you don't have anything. But what do you say to that? What do you say to the inability to be put on an equal on an equal platform where the work is being judged in the same way?
Sure. You know, I mean, when you think about it, it could be facility. I mean, the facility that the work is being done in is not as good as one of the larger theater houses in the area. Sure. But, you know, we've already talked about that. That's all relative to, you know, funding opportunities, to inequities in funding. So, you know, there's no one answer to that question. Work, artists, the theater, that the work that artists do, you know, it's always going to come with bias, but you know, as a blanket statement that, you know, Black film or Black theater or Black art is not as good as our white counterparts, you know, That's absurd.
It really is. I mean, and take as an example the Black Panther movie of 2018, right?
Absolutely.
Like it came out of nowhere and shattered all kinds of standards that were there before it. And now it's become the standard. And so it is a great example of what happens when creative justice happens, right? Like if you stop encumbering me, and I think we also have to be aware of the trappings of capitalism, right? Like, you know, we get into the work because we want the money, we want the prestige, we want the status. I have to tell myself this as well, because I mean, I would love to have a MacArthur Fellowship, right? But at the same time, I have to ask myself, Antonio, would you continue to do the work if you know that you're not going to get a MacArthur? And I have to say yes. So whether there's a MacArthur there to kind of legitimize the work that I've done or not, I'm still going to do the work because it's work that compels me. It's work that fires me up.
Absolutely.
And yet and yet there's something missing. I hear everything that you're saying, and I completely agree. You do what makes you whole, what manifests you as this magical entity on the earth. If then it is put in the hands of an inspector, a critic who has been brought up through this American system. So he is looking at your work through a different lens than he's looking at a white person's lesser work. And to him, it's better. And he doesn't even know why. He just knows that it is. Does that leave you in a purgatory that you cannot escape? And that is what concerns me. You know, do we remain heroes only unto ourselves in that respect?
Well, but see, I feel like the artist, what is the role of the artist? Right? And critics don't always have the same skill sets as the artists themselves.
No doubt.
Right? So I don't know. I tend to, ever since I read this story about how Marilyn Horne sang this German opera, and the critic just, just ripped her German to pieces. And then she called the critic the next day and answered the phone in German, right? And the critic didn't understand the German. Ever since that time, I just kind of was like, critics, But I think there's something, we have to begin to teach artists how to measure quality for themselves so that critics don't have the same kind of power over them. Because I started out as an artist. I wanted to be an opera singer. And I switched to administration at a point in my career where I felt like, there are lots of opera singers. There are a lot of people who are better than me at this craft. I think I would be better over in administration and management. I made that choice and I haven't looked back, right? But so I know what it's like to be an artist on the other end, receiving that criticism when you know the work that you've done is of quality, right? And so it is an intrapersonal, soul-searching kind of process because artists, I really value the way that they're able to courageously and boldly put it out there and be vulnerable in front of us all in these ways. And so they should get medals just for being able to do that. Like we could all use a little bit more learning and education in how to be vulnerable. And I think artists do that really well.
Thank you both. I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Benjamin Gunter. What advice would you give to a Tallahassee-based theater company who wants to collaborate with more BIPOC theater artists? Anybody want to take this?
I would start with, I'm not sure, I'm assuming that the company is a white company. So if it's you're a white company, and you haven't had the experience of doing this, I'd start with your own company and saying, why are we doing this? So start with your own reasons, start with your own understanding of the whys and how you would approach especially a cold call with a relationship. You really need to get connected through someone with another company. That's how I would at least from my vantage point, where I've had to do this before and say, okay, I want to get to a place where we need to diversify our stage, and how do we do it when we're not connected? And so we start with why are we doing this? And then we take a look at who would we want to work with, and why do we want to work with them? And we again go back to what we were just talking about now. Who are the artists that we want to work with? Look at the art form. What are some of the works that we want to do? And we start to approach it from that direction.
Then I would also interrogate for myself why I want to work with more BIPOC artists, right? Because some of the divisiveness in our society is such that some BIPOC artists are not going to trust you immediately. And if you don't have a good rationale for why you want to work with them, that's going to make you even more suspect. And so I would spend some time thinking about, why do I want to work with more BIPOC artists? Is it to deliver more creative justice? Is it to give artists more opportunities to tell all of Florida's history? I'm familiar with Theater with the Mission. As you know, I've partnered with you all on some grant writing, and there's so many stories across the state of Florida that could be told, and BIPOC artists could be integrated into doing that work. But I think you have to have a solid rationale for why you want to work with them.
Thank you all. Our next question comes from Molatiti Tassimi. Are commercial art and art that's people focused mutually exclusive?
No, they're not. They certainly can be. I mean, it's if you're starting with the purpose of making money, I think you're immediately going to run into compromising whatever the creative endeavor in some way. It doesn't mean that commercial endeavors haven't been wildly creative and deep and interesting. I suggest most of them are not, but that's me. So I just like the last question. I think it starts with a why. If we are doing work about people, when we want to interrogate these lives, these stories, why? And if that is more important to us than making money, then we go deep into that, right? If we can make money along the way, that's wonderful too. But if the need to pay for it starts to take us away from that focus that we've established a why for, an important why for, then we need to stop and reassess. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. Our next question comes from Lauren Herod. Tallahassee has an intense socioeconomic disparity that is a remnant of legal segregation, and as such show up as a modern form of segregation for the access to quality arts opportunities, both curricular and extracurricular. While Southern Shakespeare Bardling's program is accessible, it seems to be one of few that are. Are there any strategies where we can begin to implementing to increase funding for community-based access to extracurricular arts for children that don't pose an extreme price tag?
If I may, I'll just jump into this one. I think it's looking into what are the funding streams that exist right now? What are the programs that would exist would be a good match to get that to get your programming or curricular goals done. So, let's say you have an after school program and it is, but it's not arts funding that is, it's a social services funding, or there's some other kind of funding, but this is a good, like the programming is a good match. That's one way. I mean, it's looking at other non-arts funding that still that the programming though, or the curriculum has a good match. I brought up earlier about the Denver police working with theater group, and so I mean the money that was used to fund that program was not arts and culture funding, it was public safety. And so, I think that that's a pretty darn good use of public safety money, because it was the goal of that program was to use theater to help teach de-escalation, and that's a great match. And so I look at that and say, this is pulling at our thinking again at the silos that can just really we just inherit a lot of times, to say how are we funding things, or what's our approach, and can we pull at that so that the funding can go differently, can be maybe spread out amongst some different programs, so we can get some different results too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kathleen. This question comes from an anonymous attendee, Dr. Cuyler. What does putting people at the center of art look like? Can you give us an example?
Yes, I'm so happy to receive that question. So I like to think about arts and culture from a community engagement perspective. And if you look at lots of cultural organizations' mission statements, they tell you whether they're art-centric or people-centric, right? And I'll just tell you, if you do a content analysis, you'll find that most of them are arts-centric. And so they'll say things like, we exist to present, we exist to exhibit, we exist to promote, right? But how about existing to engage people around arts or through arts, right? And so a good example of this for me would be, as some of you may know, my background is in opera. The Houston Grand Opera has a subsidiary company called HGO Co. And what they've done as an example of putting people at the center of the art form and then using opera as the intervention, they have sought to engage the immigrant communities in Houston. There, I don't know if you all know this, but like over 90 languages spoken in Houston. Houston is really, really a diverse city. And so what they've sought to do is use opera to allow immigrants to tell the stories of how they left their home countries to come to the United States, and Houston specifically. So not only are they actually expanding the operatic repertoire, but they're also giving people an opportunity to tell their life stories and have them kind of ensconced through opera.
Wow.
People first, the art form is the intervention to engage people in arts and culture. And I think that's where we started at in the first place, but somehow translating arts and cultural experiences to our country, somehow we've put the art form at the center and forgotten about the people who do all the work to create the art form.
Thank you, Dr. Cuyler. So we have another anonymous attendee wondering about the panelists' thoughts on a theater program to project exclusively for the BIPOC youth of Tallahassee. As a director of a youth theater program, I struggle with outreach to young BIPOC community and wonder if a program where they might not feel like they are the only ones in the room would help open up for more diversity. Thank you. And then there's another question that we can tie into that. What are some tips you have to youth programs who are eager to recruit Black youth to the theater community?
I can jump in and say COCA has relationships with the public schools here, and that might be we could certainly help as a resource to try to get connected, to get your opportunities connected with a lot of teachers, and through those teachers, then the connection happens. That happens a lot. We've got a very robust program like that with visual arts, and so I I can check with my staff, but I would think that we could at least try to do that with theater, and I'm assuming that we would have some similar kinds of contacts if that's helpful. And if you wanted to, I'm not sure if you could give where if your information could go in the chat or in a Q&A, but if there's a way we can get your information if you'd like that. Actually, I'm at Kathleen at TallahasseeArts.org, so you can just email me and we can get that started.
Thank you, Kathleen. Did anyone else want to join in with that particular question? You know, I'll say that youth it's very hard, number one, because theater and arts is it's a very emotional type of work. It's not really competition, right? So, you know, if I have a kid, he wants to play baseball, you know, it's a competition. There's an immediate result. And with theater and art, you know, the audience might not like you, and it's your individuality that's at stake there. And sometimes it's just not something that kids want to get involved in. So, you know, as far as recruiting and getting more African-American children involved in, you know, arts and theater, they have to be exposed to it. You know, anyone has to be exposed to anything to be able to make that decision. So if you're currently running a program and your program is within a building that does not reach out to said communities, then that's going to be your uphill battle always. My children are very fortunate, and those programs do reach out to their schools. However, it's their choice not to. So it's always a stab in the dark. But yes, the way that you're going to be able to capture more of that percentage of African-American or BIPOC youth is by exposing yourself to that community. So again, if you're in a building and you haven't done any outreach, it's probably going to be very hard. And, you know, the funding might not come right away. And you also have to be sensitive to, you know, the socioeconomic situations of the community. So that's important to also consider. And that's just my 2 cents. I'm not a panelist. I'm supposed to be moderating. So let's get on with the next question.
No. It's an important 2 cents, Carol. I might add that your children are fortunate to have you, because as an artist and arts administrator, you are inclined to encourage their artistic leanings, whereas there needs to be some re-education done at the grassroots level about whether or not these are practical choices for the children in the non-white community. You know, they've certainly seen otherwise, right? And may often think otherwise, you know, and their parents may not encourage them in that direction. I have been a colleague of a man who founded a performing arts school in Yonkers, New York, called Youth Theater Interactions, which has been for many years the performing arts after school program for kids in that inner city community. And, you know, many of the parents, because of the socioeconomic condition, look at it as basically, you know, babysitting at first. They say another place for my kid to be for 2 hours. But once they're in there and they are met with the excellence in teaching, and they begin to indulge their artistic muses and artistic leanings, you know, it becomes the word spreads. So again, you know, you just got to do it. You have to start believing it and support it, you know.
And this kind of conversation is great, because I just had a middle school teacher message me to say she wants to help. So see over my shoulder, the TallahasseeArts.org. Just put a Kathleen in front of it with the K, Kathleen at TallahasseeArts.org. And whoever you are, just please email me and I'll get you connected, and we can get this ball rolling.
Wonderful. Love, love, love this. Okay, so we have a question for Keith. What projects are you working on now during the pandemic?
I have been busy throughout the pandemics, particularly the first early months where everybody was really on strict lockdown. Uh, Actually adapting a text of Othello. You know, we were talking about Othello. So much of the life of American Moor has resulted in people saying, well, what about Othello? Do you want to do it? Do you want to direct it? And the answer is generally no, I don't. I don't want much to do with this play. But again, as this particular African American actor, having had to look at this play for so long, I was compelled to figure out if there was a way to do it that satisfied me, a way to do it that that preserved the integrity of the eponymous hero, who is not centered in the play. Oddly enough, here's this play called Othello, and it's about this other guy, you know, that people go to see, you know, and the black man ends up looking like a fool. Okay, well, how do we get past that? How do I create a version of that? I can't, you know, it ends the way it ends. He does what he does, but we all do. It's the reasons for that. If we go back and look at them, right? Whatever whatever the individual, whatever the community does, the end result is a result because of all that has come before it. So creating that and understanding that and making that clear in the play has been the process. So I've been working on that and figuring out where we as performing artists can go and work on this, maybe in a quarantine bubble somewhere for a few months. But really, that's what I'm looking to do next, is, you know, get in a room with a bunch of actors and see, am I telling the truth here? Is this making any sense? Where do I need to go to have it make sense? Speak back to me. Let's work.
Absolutely. Our next question, I am from New York, and I was and am in shock at the segregation in Tallahassee. It still blows my mind that there is Black theater and white theater, and that is discussed openly and is accepted as a given. And a shout out to Keith Cobb. For a while, we were neighbors. I lived a town over from North Terrytown. So I think they just wanted to give you a shout out. But yes, yeah, theater is done very differently in Tallahassee. But I will say that over these last few months that I've been working on this town hall with Southern Shakespeare and ETA, and even the roundtable with the theater houses, that, you know, everyone has admitted that things need to get better, and that's where it needs to start, which is why that we're having this town hall. So thank you for your comment.
I also want to say that I don't think that the Black theater, white theater discussion only happens in Tallahassee. There are Black theater companies all over the country. And I think their experiences are very similar to some of the experiences that we're describing here. And I think that would be actually a really good research project, is to get a better understanding of how Black theater companies make sense of inequity, and how it impacts and impedes their creative justice as cultural organizations, right? So yeah, I used to live up north in New York City. I lived in Washington D.C. too, and sometimes they act like they don't have their own versions of racism and discrimination up north, and it exists there too. I think it's just a little bit more covert.
So we have another question from, hopefully I'm not butchering this person's name, but Chiron from London, UK, and this is for Keith. Do actors overall feel isolated in a career which doesn't provide steady employment for whatever reason? Or perhaps they have an inherent feeling of independence when choosing to take certain roles?
I can only speak for myself. I tell people all the time, if there's anything that you would just as soon do as a career choice. If it's an either or, I say go do that, because anything is going to offer you greater opportunities and be easier to pursue than this. You know, acting and a pursuit of a career in the arts depends a great deal on good fortune. It just does. You know, you can be wonderful. There are a great many wonderful colleagues of mine, actors, directors, writers, who will never be seen and heard from, no matter how wonderful they are, just because they you know, it's a matter of fate. Being African American adds another layer to that, because there is another reason to separate you, to discriminate you, to look at against you, to look at you through a different lens, to assess you through a different lens. But for me, as per usual, I can't do anything else. I can't show up any other way. I can't not be an actor any more than I could not be any other part of my African American self. So I have to show up. Is it lonely? Is it a lonely life? Yeah, you know, only the hugely successful will tell you that it's not, that it's not a struggle and a slog, you know. No reason not to do it if that's what you do, because there is something wonderful about the divine and unique idea that you are, the thing that you bring to the table, unlike anybody else, the reason that you're here. If you are pursuing your purpose and you feel it as such, you can do no other thing. Right? I encourage you to do no other thing. Right? Wherever that takes you, it is our gift that you are that you are giving us. You know, it's your gift to us. I hope that sort of answers the question.
I think so. We have a couple more questions here, so I'm gonna try to get those in. So as a vast majority of white managed theater organizations in Tallahassee do not pay their actors, and often only pay their directors, designers, and musicians a stipend for weeks and weeks of work, do you feel this contributes to racial inequality in the community or not?
Yes.
So I can speak from my experience. So, you know, we've got the issue of really how many Black theater organizations are there in Tallahassee. And I've had the privilege of working with one, and I was paid for acting. My organization, ETA, the way that we're established, we do pay the production crew, and sometimes our actors will get a stipend. Our work currently has all been virtual. And so that particular stipend was not something that was discussed. Now, I have been in other community theater shows and wasn't paid a dime. Also, in educational theater, actors are not paid. I don't feel like it was racial inequity. I don't feel like, because my white counterparts weren't paid either in those particular white, predominantly white theaters. So that's my personal experience. It's the structure. And if community theaters are paying their actors, then I'd like to know, and I'd like to audition, so.
Yeah, and the reason why I said yes is because of racial inequality in terms of wealth and finances and accesses to finances. Some people simply cannot afford to spend that much time in rehearsal, make that kind of commitment, and not get compensated. It's the same thing that happens in the cultural sector with unpaid internships. A lot of Black, Indigenous, and people of color cannot afford to do an unpaid internship. And that again leads us to this issue of, well, you know, a lot of white people who can afford to do an unpaid internship are going to get the internship, they're going to build their network, and they're going to advance. And so it's something that we have to fix, because again, it goes back to that cycle. We ask for so much money and we ask for so much from people, but we aren't always making the investments and returning and giving as much back.
Yeah, I'm going to just pipe in and say, I think we've in this room before, we've talked about a cultural volunteerism in the Tallahassee, Leon County area, which is really lovely in some respects, and then in other respects it's not. And this is one of them where it's not, where you just, again, it becomes the intentionality and the actions that you're going to take when you're going to be putting on a show. So, is everyone getting compensated? Is everyone getting something? That's the first place to start. The other place that we just touched on the very beginning was training. So if you have a lot of directors and stage technicians and everybody's white, and you have actors that are mixed race and so on, and then you're paying out the directors and you're paying out by role, you may end up inadvertently creating an inequitable system without really intending on doing that. And I keep bringing up intentionality because that is, you have to constantly, especially when you're in leadership positions, look at what you've been trained and what you've inherited to say, what is what's cool, what do we want, what's great, and we want to carry forward, and what do we need to change. And this is part of it. And we've got a richness of schools around here with universities and so on that got great training programs, and I'm just hoping that that we're going to be able to see more stage managers, directors, lighting technicians, and so on and so forth to really disrupt the whole entire industry, so that that we don't have to talk about this anymore.
So we have a question from Terry Galloway. Do you see this struggle for equitable representation as a struggle to reinvigorate theater itself? Could a push to get many more different kinds of bodies on our stages become a part of a push to reclaim and reinspect every kind of traditional theater that is out there to do? Black, queer, disabled.
Yes. There we go. Go good. Yes. That's. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
That's it. That's it. Do it.
I want to I'm thankful for this question, because it also reminds us about our own thinking on this, to make sure that we're constantly, breaking down the walls and making sure that the flow through of how we're approaching who it is that's on our stage is just, is as fluid as possible. And so in like an interrogation in the sense of theater, to say, is all this blending going on? And are we making sure when we talk about representation that the representation question is also incredibly eclectic? I know that tonight's town hall was more focused than that, but it really is a more eclectic question that we need to carry forward.
Okay, we've got 3 more questions. I'm going to try to get through them. This is the chicken or the egg first question. Do predominantly white theater companies pick diverse shows and then hope Black directors apply? Or do they approach a known talented Black director and ask, would you want to do it? It seems like it is, but is this even a binary choice? And is any of that just tokenism?
Oof.
Yeah.
Well, I think it would be tokenism if you have one Black director and they're not a good director, right? But if you have a Black director who's a good director, and if you have more than one Black director, or if you have a diverse slate of directors who have a whole lot of different identities, and hopefully some that even intersect, right? Like Black women, Black queer women, that you're getting a fresh look at something that maybe you've done before, but this director is revealing something about this piece that you hadn't seen before, this play that you hadn't seen before, right?
And you would know them by going out and experiencing the work, right? Going out and seeing these people in their theaters, doing the work that they do, beginning to have conversations with all these creatives about what they do and how and why, and you know, beginning to form opinions for yourself about who might be the best for your project, and then talking to them about it, you know, or about what the product might be. You know, what is it that you would, if given the opportunity to work in our theater, what would you like to create here? No.
So our next question is, what do you have to say to theater directors who say, we try to cast Black actors, but they don't come to auditions?
I would say, why not? Like, is there something that happened to previous Black auditionees that they have created a network to protect each other, and they say, you don't want to go audition there because they're racist, or you don't want to go audition there because they're sexist, right? But also, let's say that there hasn't been some horrible racist or sexist experience that has turned them off from auditioning. I think one of the things that researchers told us is that BIPOC folks have more diverse networks, professionally and personally, than white people. And so again, going back to what Keith said, you got to go see the work, and you got to introduce yourself, and you have to do the work of diversifying your networks. That's one of the reasons why we haven't had more gains when it comes to diversity, because if you keep hiring people who look like you and who think like you, we'll never actually see the kinds of diversity that are representative already in our society.
I want to piggyback on what Antonio says, that intentionality has got to be authentic, because you'll, even the best intentions won't, if you're about being authentic about it, then it's not going to work, and then you should wait. You should wait till it's the right time. It's you know, I take the personal approach. I ask people when I was running theaters and doing that before I came here. I just asked people, "Do you feel welcome here?" And I mean, they would say yes, or they would say no. They said no. You know, I just don't feel. I feel I can come in here when I have my show, my people, but I don't feel that I could come to just any of your other performances, because I just don't feel that this space is very welcome to. These were mainly Asian American companies, dance companies, and theater companies, and so on. And I just listened. And said, okay. So then it's, you know, how do you try to change that? And that's your journey that you got to figure out yourself. But it is about really finding out what the truth is, and then accepting what that is, and then making sure that it's not the culture that you want it to be, but that it's actually the culture that is, and that if you believe that you're being welcoming, that's awesome. But it's really, what really matters is what other people are telling you, what they think and what they feel, and listen to them and believe them.
Should race be a part of the application process when selecting a production team in the community theater?
This is, you know, I feel like I need to defer to, you know, the professionals on the ground in Tallahassee, because we're speaking, I think, mostly about what's going on there. I continue to go back to, if you've done the work and you have had the education that brings you to understand that our inclusion will make us better theater, then you're already on to the part about making better theater, and it's no longer something that you are, you know, making the issue. Or if you find yourself casting and comprising a creative staff of only white people, you know why, and you can stop and say, well, what am I doing, and why am I doing this? You have the ability to self-interrogate that, right, and make other choices, right? If you're doing the creative justice work, you know, but I don't think we can codify anything or set everybody at this juncture should know that better theater is made by the pastiche, you know. Simple as that.
So I think that wraps up the questions that we have for the evening. I would like to give our panelists an opportunity to provide any closing comments to our audience members.
I'd just like to say thank you all for joining us this evening for this conversation. I really appreciate having you come and support and be a part and solicit questions. Thank you.
What Antonio said, plus the fact that I'm really thrilled that this conversation's happening here. I also am, if you know people that should be here tonight that just couldn't make it or didn't know about this, please continue to spread the word, because I want to make sure COCA steps into the space and helps out as much as possible. And I also just offer again at Kathleen at TallahasseeArts.org, if you want to share some thoughts with me, please do. I'm here to assist in our community with what our community needs. And so please let me know how I can also help continue to step into the space with this organization and its resources.
I am simply grateful to have been concluded and heard, and I am hopeful. Such meetings as this make me hopeful that we are gathered and we are discussing. But and at the end of the day, we all need to be doers. We need to step out and do it. But you give me hope, and I'm grateful. Thank you.
I'd like to thank my panelists for participating and for giving us so much of your personal self as well as your professional self. And to my audience members for submitting such compelling, great questions, and for joining us to do this work. Like we stated before, there's work to be done. And this is just the first part of our 3-part series. So please be on the lookout for dates for our upcoming second part of our series. And also, we want to let you know that if you want to view this again, or if you have people that wanted to be here but couldn't be here, like Kathleen said, there's a recording. You can find that recording on our social media sites. And when I say our social media sites, let me iterate that it's Essential Theatrical Associates or Southern Shakespeare. So if you reach out to those social media outlets, you should be able to find that or this recording. Thank you all so much. We're ending a little bit early, just 6 minutes, but I'm pretty sure on a Thursday night, we'll all be grateful to get those few minutes back. So looking forward to doing this again. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.